Hey everyone, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. The front lines in Ukraine are relatively stable for now. And we are right now in a mud season where it's very difficult to go on the offensive for one or the other side in the war. So I want to take this moment to take assessment of what's the situation on the front line, go over it thoroughly, and then also talk about the predictions where Russia would be attacking or Ukraine would be attacking, and what are the potential scenarios for development for the future. So this is going to be a two-part video. In this video today, we're going to be looking at the front line and assessing the situation. And then tomorrow, I'm going to release the second part where I'm going to discuss what's the future possibilities. Because some of the articles that I'm seeing right now about where potentially Russia can strike are so obnoxiously out of this world BS that I cannot even handle it anymore. So we're going to do it tomorrow. But today, let's take a look at the front lines. So after half a year of efforts, Russia was able to capture the village or like an outskirts of the city of Donetsk of Avdiivka. Since then, the question was whether or not Russia will be able to develop that or not. We covered this many times in previous videos, so I'm just going to briefly mention it, that Russia has struggled since mid-February to get to the new Ukrainian positions, which are along this river over here. And these positions are the stationary for Ukraine because main Ukrainian positions are located right over the river. If we switch to the topographic map over here, this is what you will see. So red is high and the colors like green and blue are the low position. This is about the area of that river. And this is the high ground, basically, where Ukrainians are keeping their positions. So as you can see, Ukrainians are comfortably sitting behind some kind of water barriers, which have proven, even the smallest one, have proven to be very, very crucial to defensive lines. And they're having a great positions here. So in all of that, to summarize what happened at Avdiivka was Russians tried to do an attack. They didn't get much of it. They've tried, they attacked, but they didn't really, they weren't really able to push out. And if I switch to the topographic map back again, you will see that if we kind of move a little bit to the north, you see that there is actually like a whole ridge on the high ground where there's certain lines going, and this is the village of Ocheretine. So if we switch to the deep state map right over here, so this is the village of Ocheretine, and this line that is over here, and yeah, I know what you're going to say, so I'm going to draw this circle over here as well. Yes, but this line that goes towards Ocheretine is actually railway. And railway here is a known position for Ukrainians that Russia wants to attack on this ridge because they have already the defensive positions along the river. So they know that this is a weak point, and this weak point has been very, very extensively fortified in this area. Russians tried to move towards the area, but they are having extreme difficulties. While there might be no water barrier that prevents Russians to move there, Ukrainians are well aware that this is the bottleneck that they need to defend, and therefore it's being prevented. The only unsecure area for Ukrainians there is around Avdiivka is the southern part. So the southern part, the defensive line goes kind of like over this and towards this water body, and then Ukrainians have an additional river over here that they can try to use as a defensive position. However, here in this area, as you can see, there is no name of the settlements, so there is little to no kind of build-up area. There's mostly fields, maybe some tree lines in the area. But generally, this triangle is probably the weakest positions for Ukrainians there are currently. It's unfortunate. While by itself, if Ukraine loses this triangle of positions, it doesn't really matter that much. The problem becomes that then Russians would be able to strike Ukrainian logistical channels towards defense of Pervomayske, which is located right over here in this area. So therefore making the situation in Pervomaysk a little bit more difficult for Ukrainians, and therefore starting to kind of erode the position. And this is something that if you've been following the channel, that you know that I've talked about, that this can cause the chain reaction for like Russians. I should use red for Russians. Russians try to attack, they collapse this part of the logistics, then logistics gets eroded, then they move south, they collapse Krasnohorivka, then that allows them to collapse the logistics in this area, collapse the logistics then around Novomikhailivka, Pobeda, and then kind of move towards Vuhledar from the north, therefore kind of cutting off this whole side of the section. It's a potential plan, but it's like a obvious plan. Ukrainians know about this, therefore they're well aware what to expect and what defenses they require, so they're able to concentrate the efforts. Obviously, it's dependent on resources, but again, we're going to touch about it a little bit later. Then the situation of Marinka. Again, another victory that Russia proclaimed over like many months ago was the final occupation of Marinka. And Marinka is, while a good defensive positions for Ukrainians, isn't really by itself that beneficial for Russians. Because while they're taking Marinka, they are unfortunately exposed to Ukrainian attacks from the sides, both from Krasnohorivka and this area around Novomikhailivka and Paraskoviivka, where they're having a little bit of a high ground vision over the situation around Marinka. And here Russians are just in a very bad positions for themselves. They're being shot up essentially from three sides. They cannot really advance, and so far their attempts have been very pitiful. So we should not expect that Russians suddenly start breaking out in Marinka. Therefore, we should watch about what else Russia wants to do. Our obvious weak point, I talked about that there was a high ground for Ocheretina a little bit before, and it was a known bottleneck. In the same way, there is a known bottleneck for Novomikhailivka for Ukrainians right over here. And after Russia tried to go into the Vuhledar and attack it from the south, the issue being attacking from the south is that there is like a river here, and then Russians tried to cross the river and they established themselves a little bit above the river. But the problem is that the positions here are like so well maintained by Ukrainians that Russians just got obliterated again and again and again. Before Avdiivka happened, the slaughter around Vuhledar was the biggest slaughter we saw since the start of the war. Avdiivka now is pretty much taking over that, at least in amount of vehicles burned for sure. But Vuhledar, Russia just cannot push it through the south. It's just not a very favorable position. As soon as they cross the river, wherever they can, they just get obliterated and it doesn't work. So they adjusted their plan, and the idea was if they're able to push through this bottleneck of Novomikhailivka, then they would be able to then go out towards Novomikhailivka to Vodyane and then attack Vuhledar from the north, which they want. However, Ukrainians know about this bottleneck, and that's why Novomikhailivka and Russians around Novomikhailivka have been stuck here for many months. And reports from there are obviously that the fighting is hard. It's never easy for Ukrainians, but they are holding still. But we should not discount that Russians may try to hit this area or more. If we're talking about the southern front line over here, this line is generally stable both for Russians and Ukrainians. If you remember, there was this a little bit of a salient over here, like a bulge for Russians, and Ukrainians were able to cut it off during the summer offensive. And while a notable removal Russians from the territory of Ukraine, in general, that bulge was less beneficial for the Russians. They are quite okay with this front line, and it's stable. So if Russia even wants to do anything at this part of the front line, then they would need to kind of put additional forces to create some kind of move here. And Ukrainians are fortifying these lines, so I would not expect Russians to do anything at this area for the foreseen future. Situation around Robotyne. Now, this is a little bit of a divisive. On one side, this salient for Ukrainians is not very stable, at least the way that it looks, because Russians have them in a little bit of a pocket, so they can attack them from all sides. The problem is that Russians have turned Robotyne in a fortress. That's why it took Ukrainians so long to take it. And they built a lot of the underground subterranean networks in the area that were able to be sustained for a long time. And now the same fortifications that Russians built around Robotyne, and they put a lot of effort to build them, is now playing against Russians themselves. We've seen time and time again in this area that once Russians try to kind of attack, they're able to cross certain gray areas, certain open areas. But as soon as they reach fortified positions, as soon as they reach some kind of fortifications that Ukrainians are using here, and they've been using and fortifying them themselves, then Russians get instantly stuck and they cannot advance. So again, while this salient looks from the top down as a wow, this is like really bad for Ukrainians, in reality this is a great fortified position, and it's been doing its job quite well. Without significant efforts, Russia cannot cut this out. This would be essentially another sort of a battle for Avdiivka if Russians would want to take it. With area right over here, the geography here is not in Russian favor. Ukrainians basically control like a high ground all across this ridge right over here. So Ukrainians have naturally favorable positions here to defend. Therefore, I would not be, again, expecting that Russians will be advancing in the area. Area around Krynky. Look, Russians have not dislodged Ukrainians from Krynky. Ukrainians are still there, but again, I am still very skeptical about what is the used for, and if it's a needed area, and if Ukraine can develop anything from it. Krynky has played a crucial role in a couple of latest months because it was a pain in the ass for Russians. They didn't want to get Ukrainians and have Ukrainians on their side of the Kherson region, so they tried to, occupied side of the Kherson region. So they tried to dislodge Ukrainians. The problem of dislodging Ukrainians is that before the area of Krynky, there is only so many ways that they can approach. There are not many approach vectors for Russians to have, and logistics here are not as close for Russians. So whenever there was an attack towards Ukrainian-held Krynky, they knew it in advance, and then the artillery and the drone operators from both Krynky and from the other shore, they were just completely pummeling Russians. Therefore, Russians, they are containing Ukrainians in the area, but they more or less stopped their massive efforts to dislodge Ukrainians from the effort. However, I'm still very skeptical as to what is the potential of this, and so far I don't really see the benefits of it. If we go into the north part, then around the north, I have explained many times, the main part in the north is this fort of Sinkivka. Sinkivka is a key point in this whole area. If Russians cannot take Sinkivka, they cannot advance. They cannot really advance pretty much anywhere from this side, just because of the natural geography and the way that who controls Sinkivka controls this northern approach. And we saw that exactly. Every time Russians tried to advance from any other side, and they, for example, attacked Sinkivka at the same time, as soon as Russians from Sinkivka were able to be dislodged, then all of these attacks and any of these attacks were instantly pushed back, and they failed. So unless something threatens Sinkivka, and so far it's been holding strong, nothing will come of it. This part over here is pretty much the same story, so I'm gonna explain it very pretty much like this one as well. So in this area, the villages are very scarce, and there's a lot of kind of field and open ground, and Ukrainians have been building fortification in this line, and they have better logistics in the area as well. So Russians here, every time they try to attack, they would go maybe a kilometer, like a little bit more in depth into Ukrainian territory, and then they find themselves in a very disadvantageous positions. So, and every effort that they did to try to penetrate deep enough to Ukrainian positions, then they failed, mostly because they are so deep. Long story short, there is no good positions for Russians to kind of come in that they can traverse in a short enough amount of time to then grab that position and use it as a hub for their development. There is nothing really here. I should have been using red for Russians. But all in all, this is not a very favorable ground for Russians to advance, just because Ukrainians have these things figured out, and most of these villages are desolated right now, and unfortunately that's the truth. Then there is this salient. So Ukrainian defense around Terny, Yampolivka, Zarychne are very crucial in this factor. And Ukrainians know that. That's why they're defending it. They're defending it both on this side of this water body, but they're also supporting it from the other side of the lake. And Russians here have tried to advance towards these areas constantly during the past months. They've tried to do this, and they're having the same trouble time and time again. They are having a very unfavorable positions because they're just instantly get caught in crossfire. The area on the south here is forest, and there is a lot of hidden Ukrainian positions in the forest. And Ukrainians are using them to, as soon as Russians try to advance, they try to cross this big field that is located right over here. This area is colored red, but it's not completely correct because it's like a field. It's more of like a no man's land in between here. And as soon as Russians try to cross this no man's land, they just get instantly obliterated. And finally, pre-finally, Bilohorivka area right over here. Here Ukrainians are very much in favor again of the position because they're standing on Bilohorivka. It's a big hill. It's a huge hill that had seen many battles. Many Russians died on that hill. And so far, Russians have not been able to scale it. The line goes precisely around that hill, and that hill is pretty much dominating this whole southern sector. On the south over here, again, the same kind of situation as I talked above. There is just no big villages to kind of grab to use as a base. And as soon as they try to advance, Ukrainians are just seeing the Russians and they're kicking them out. So it's a very unhealthy situation for Russians to be in. And then we'll finish up with Bakhmut. And Bakhmut, in the south of Bakhmut, Ukrainians, despite the tough push from Russians, are still controlling the high ground around Klishivka, Andriivka, and around here. So Russians have been trying to get on the high ground areas, but they failed. And I explained that the only way that they can kind of dislodge Ukrainians from this area, I believe right now, because drones are very efficient, is if they will take Ivanivske and they then would be able to collapse and kind of attack Ukrainians from behind. The problem that Russians did is that Ukrainians have used both Ivanivske and Bogdanivka. It's the same story for these two settlements. Russians advance, they move towards Ivanivske, they get into Ivanivske, they capture half of the city, and then they get absolutely stalled. Bogdanivka, Russians move to Bogdanivka, they get to about half of the settlement of the Bogdanivka, and then they get stalled. Basically, Ukrainians have grabbed Russians and stick them in these not unfavorable, but extremely difficult city fights in both Ivanivske and Bogdanivka, so Russians cannot really advance in these directions. What Russians would want to do is, after they collapse the southern flank, they would like to go to the Chasiv Yar. Now, Chasiv Yar is a Ukrainian fortress, and Ukrainian fortress it is. It has a lot of natural defensive bodies. If you can look and see, it has like both lakes and everything. It's also on a little bit of a hill, so it's like on a higher ground. It's also Russians to attack uphill as well in general, and the only way that they could have tried to do it is essentially go around Chasiv Yar to kind of semi-encircle and maybe go around it to essentially recreate Avdiivka situation. But the problem of Avdiivka situation is that the main reason that are many analysts are now saying why Russians were able to capture Avdiivka is because if you look at the map, Avdiivka is right next to Donetsk. It's literally just the suburbs of Donetsk. Donetsk is it's over 1 million people city. It's a huge city, huge urban area. Russians were having both here the support for their logistics. They were having the ability to hide a lot of their forces movements and so on. It's a unique situation that no one else on the map they have. So for them to try to attack Avdiivka was basically a lucky break. Everything else just looks awful for Russia. So all in all, in the last 6 months, Russia was able to capture about 250 kilometers of the Ukrainian land. And some pro-Russian shills obviously stated to say it's a great victory of Russia because now they're gonna go and capture stuff and so on. And it's about the same as saying, oh my god, look at that slug. It's the fastest slug I have ever seen. In the last week, it had traveled a whole meter. That doesn't mean that slugs are about to overtake us on the full marathon distance as the fastest runners. So, not comparable. If Russia's the decisive objectives are essentially to take out the Ukrainian forces and maybe take over the Donbas region, then this is the borders that they need. And this is all battle uphill, and there are many places similar size to Avdiivka that they need to go through. There are a lot of layers of fortifications that Ukrainians have built, and they are very well aware of what's coming. All in all, the biggest Russian advantage and why they're able to attack is the fact that the Western allies are not supplying Ukraine with enough resources. So Russia has the ultimate advantage in resources so far. They will be advancing. We should be very clear about that. But the main advantage that Russia is having is the glide bombs, the big glide bombs that Russia is having. We see that Russian, despite all of the advancements and adaptations that they're doing to war, they are getting better at this, unfortunately. But in general, the principles of tactics that they're using are still the same. It's to destroy everything before them, to then allow your vehicles and infantry, poorly trained infantry, to get in there and kick the Ukrainians out of whatever is left. If before they were using a lot of their artillery to achieve this, to basically grind everything before them into the paste, now there was an issue with Russian artillery with not enough supplies. Now, Russian artillery is not as prevalent as it was in the start of the war. However, the aviation now is able to use these bombs, which are dealing enormous damage and costing a lot of Ukrainian lives, unfortunately. So Ukraine needs more air defense to protect against this. Once Ukraine will be able to be protected against these aerial attacks, then the Russians will stall completely, especially if Ukraine will also get an influx of additional resources such as artillery shells. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to help the channel, please click subscribe if you haven't done so before. This really helps the YouTube algorithm to recommend this video to others if someone subscribes during the viewing. We're going to review tomorrow the possible vectors of Russian attack and how they will plan to achieve it. And we're going to take apart some of the nonsensical ones. I love you all. Slava Ukraini, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.